Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about what could be called my theory of literature. Um, I want to start off by saying I don't want to talk about literature with a capital L, even though I'm going to be using examples from classic literature and even what could be considered contemporary highbrow literature. I'm not using literature in the pretentious sense. In fact, I want to challenge conventional notions of literature with the capital L. So I want to start by um, going off Oscar Wilde's quote, which is that all art is useless and that it merely exists to represent beauty. So the only purpose of art is to be beautiful. Now, I think that I've always thought that this is an interesting claim, art for art's sake, as Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater would describe it. I've always thought it was an interesting view, but I don't feel like it's a fair view in a lot of ways. Now, my thought is I think that literature and writing has a lot of purposes. I think that it can do a lot of things. Um, and so I don't want to limit it to my theory of what I think literature is because I think that my theory expands to all of these other notions. I think that um, art does indeed have the ability to just be art for art's sake. I think that that can be great art. I think that art can be beautiful. I think that art has a lot of functions. But the theory that I want to propound is the idea that art, um, or specifically fiction and poetry, um, what I need to do is I need to restrict myself to simply literature as poetry and fiction because it's very easy for me to delve into other fields such as philosophy and even things that wouldn't necessarily be considered literature like psychology. And I need to limit it to that. And when even talking about the arts, I need to limit it to not even like talking about painting and stuff, which I could also delve into, but I don't want to do. I want to keep it very specific. But anyway, to get to my point, um, I feel like my theory of literature, at least one of the things that means the most to me when I read, is literature that can talk about existence, literature that communicates existence. That is kind of an existential claim in a sense, thinking about existence, questioning existence. But I want to start with some very basic examples throughout classical literature, with the capital L, unfortunately, but just bear with me. Goethe, he was part of the Storm and Stress movement in German Romanticism. Storm and Stress was kind of its own romantic movement, but he's still considered part of German Romanticism. And so there's this beautiful passage in Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, where he describes how he basically wants to put a bullet through his head. Now, here's the thing. The Sorrows of Young Werther is a very pretentious title, or it could be seen as a pretentious title. It could be seen as kind of this like this poor lost romantic, and why should we feel any empathy for this poor, this poor Werther? Why should we feel empathy for the sorrow of him? It's a very conventional title in some senses. It's very literature with a capital L. And yet, when you read the book and get past the language, what you find is this very deep existential longing, this very deep existential yearning. And in my opinion, that makes the book pretty cool. That it's talking about something something pretty radical in a sense. I mean, it's talking about suicide, and it's taking suicide very seriously. It's taking the feelings of disenchantment and ostracism and broken hearts like very seriously. And to me, that's important because it captures existence. I could throw another name out there, another name where you probably just want to groan. That would, of course, be Shakespeare. But if you actually read Shakespeare, it's not quite that simple to just say, oh, the guy who wrote sonnets, the guy who wrote about love and romantic love. There's a lot more to it. So, if you read plays like A Winter's Tale, what's beautiful about that is its emphasis on mental illness. Leonidas, the king, who basically goes insane, and then his son dies because of his really bad decisions. His son dies of grief, and when we think of Shakespeare, we think of the bard, we think of the immoral bard, we think of somebody that's not going to be knocked off their pedestal, and therefore they are knocked off their pedestal because we're looking at them in terms of greatness, and we realize that they're not great. They were just a writer. Now, what I want to challenge is not the idea of greatness, but I do want to challenge the idea of literature with capital L. While I wouldn't dispute the idea that Shakespeare is definitely great art, great literature, I think that that is a complete misunderstanding of what Shakespeare has done. So when you look at plays like Troilus and Cressida, you see plays of complicated love. You see a play about complicated love. You don't see a play about straightforward romantic love that just works perfectly without any problems. No, it's completely existential. It's completely despaired. You could also get to other names like Dickens. So Oliver Twist. I'm sure that's another name where you groan because it's just like, oh man, Charles Dickens, that boring Victorian writer. And that would make sense and that would be fair. But think about the actual story of Oliver Twist. I mean, Oliver Twist was a homeless kid. And I think that he was an orphan. And it's about his harsh journeys, as you would know. And when you look at it, not in terms of its context in literature and great literature, but look at it in context of the story, I think that it carries a different meaning. It carries this meaning of deep existential probing. And I feel like, ironically, all of these writers are setting the stage for existentialism, which pretty much is like the pinnacle of this kind of questioning of existence and understanding existence. So we get to Dostoevsky. I've heard him being described as being very pretentious, but maybe he's pretentious in terms of the writing. Maybe the writing is too highfalutin or whatever. But when you think about what he's actually saying, it's actually this very deep, nihilistic, rebellious sense. I can't help but think of his beautiful writing in, I think it's Notes from the Underground, which is about the writer who's a complete rebel, completely dissatisfied with life, completely dissatisfied with existence. And he basically says that the human species is ungrateful. Now, is that literature as we would describe it with a capital L? I'm not quite sure. Because when we think of literature with a capital L, we think of beauty. We think of like flowers and roses. We think of Wordsworth writing about daffodils. We think of all of, but like that's not necessarily what literature is. And I think that that is what makes literature so completely compelling. This is especially true by the time you get to the modernists and the postmodernists. So when you think about William Faulkner and the Sound and the Fury, like so sure, we might consider it boring literature because of its insanely experimental writing structure. His stream of consciousness, Faulkner's stream of consciousness, where he just completely uses all of these words that we don't know. But when you get to the core of it, when you get to the story, Benji Compson's story is essentially he is a wounded person. He was castrated, and he was and he suffers from a mental disorder. I'm not going to use the word that I'm thinking because I think that it's inappropriate. But if you read the story, you know what I mean. Limited cognitive capacities. But I think that, and so I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. I think that actually captures some of the beauty of William Faulkner's story. That limitation, that thing that we would consider ugly and hideous, is actually very beautiful. And I think that it's beautiful because it's such a probing of existence. This is the same by the time you get to writers like Antonin Artaud, who suffered from schizophrenia, most likely, suffered from at least mental disorders. He was definitely a schizoid personality. He has this great poem that's called Van Gogh, the Man Suicided by Society. Again, that is not, in my opinion, literature with a capital L. That is doing something completely different. That is thinking about existence. And so what I want to say about this literature with a capital L is our notions of literature is kind of outdated. So we think that literature is pretentious. We think that literature is for the highbrow people. We think that literature is not for the common man, so to speak. Shakespeare and Dickens would disagree naturally because they were reaching the average reader. But my point is, these works that we wouldn't normally associate with are actually works that carry this deep significance because they write so much about existence. And I think that to me is literature with a capital L. And so basically what I'm doing is redefining our notions of like stuffiness. So like when we read Hawthorne, we're not thinking of the fact that he's writing about a deal with the devil. We're thinking about his unbelievably pretentious language. And I think that is definitely underserving Nathaniel Hawthorne and all of the things that he's writing about. That's another topic. I could go into Nathaniel Hawthorne, but I think you get the basic idea. And so I want to close. Well, how much time do I have? Yeah, I pretty much need to close. But I want to start off with Murakami. Now, Murakami I would consider to be a pretty cool writer. I imagine in a century from now, 2 centuries from now, he's going to be seen as another stuffy, postmodern writer, much like the Victorians are seen nowadays. But let me read just a couple paragraphs from his book, Kafka on the Shore. "So you're all set for money then?" the boy named Crow asks in his typical sluggish voice. The kind of voice like when you've just woken up and your mouth still feels heavy and dull. But he's just pretending. He's totally awake as always. I nod. "How much?" I review the numbers in my head. Close to 3,500 in cash, plus some money. I can get from an ATM. I know it's not a lot, but it should be enough for the time being. Not bad, the boy named Crow says, for the time being. Now, one of the things that I find very talented about Murakami is this kind of, the immediacy of his writing. Some people will probably consider that pretentious, but I would disagree. And I would disagree because the writing to me feels immediate, and it feels immediate because it's this very casual, very vernacular style of writing, and it's immediate in that sense. And it's just got like this kind of punk feel. Murakami could be described as one of the punks of the postmodern era. While he may lack some of the linguistic sophistication of Toni Morrison, I think that it makes up in his tone. It's made up in his tone and his ideas. That's a whole other topic. The point that I want to get at is Murakami is a writer who captures kind of what I'm getting at with this whole thing of existence and kind of the immediacy of literature in general. Again, I've said this, I think part of the reason why we have trouble with more classical writers, is because of the language. But I think that the language is merely a distraction when you get to what they're really saying. I think that the language contributes to the artistic feel of the art and the work, but I feel like it's not necessarily the best part. I feel like the best part is what these writers are really saying, and what these writers and artists and poets are really saying, and that is that existence is difficult, existence is hard, and basically we're writing this to try to understand. Now, of course, I'm projecting my own ideas of what writing is on literature, on classic literature. I could be way off. Frankenstein may be this highfalutin text that does not describe feelings of ostracism, feelings of not belonging, and all of the mad scientist ideas that could be taken from it. And I'm not joking about that, by the way. That's not a joke. But kind of the, how it's very easy to make, well, you know what I mean. I mean, you've read it, the idea of dilemmas and stuff like that. But the point being that, we're definitely free to see literature as this impossibly highfalutin thing that just exists and that we shouldn't bother with. But I think that when you dig deeper, you would be surprised. And again, that's only my theory of fiction and poetry and literature. And there's always a lot more I could say, but I think we'll leave it at that. And like I said, I'm not trying to limit literature to that function of questioning existence and asking about what existence is, but I feel like that's definitely one of the amazing things that can come out of it. And that's why, to me at least, literature is very valuable, and I think that it could be valuable to you if you are willing to take that plunge into thinking about existence and trying to underscore and uncover some of the more complicated nuances of our complicated lives. This is Phoenix, and thank you.